So I've been going back and re-examining a performance piece that I produced in the late 1980s called Displacements. And the reason for that re-examination I have been talked about and discussed in various ways as I've returned to the piece. But my concern has been with the relationship between action that participants are invited to perform in aesthetic and artistic experiences as a metaphor or analogy for our participation in the larger work of social justice, particularly in this moment today, and the necessity for our engaged and active participation in the events that are occurring around us. And it's been my intention to explore, some of the psychological and experiential contexts in which our actions and our engagement in the important events of the world can be mediated or silenced or repressed or suppressed or intimidated. And the return to this piece has been as much for me to reopen my mind to some of the issues that I attempted to address initially in the work, as much as it has been to try to open up a dialogue concerning spaces of engagement versus spaces of containment, let's say. So, with all of that, in the background, as the context for which I'm looking at these works, I've talked about the way that images that I've had for this particular piece that I titled Displacements have been lost over time, and that I've had to make these new substitutions with various images that I have managed to retain over the years, or that I've been working with more recently. So So the images that are being presented here are various kinds of photographs and drawings, photographs of those drawings, and superimpositions of images, including the reflections that occur in the room in which I'm narrating this discussion upon the screen that those images are being projected on. Some of them are relevant to the piece, and some of them are more challenging in terms of the connections that you might want to make. But that activity is, part of the engagement that I want to discuss, so I think that that's relevant as well. What I wanted to talk about specifically today, or perhaps I should say narrate today, because a lot of what goes into the discussion is personal history, biography, and an explanation for the way that I'm going to talk about the specific relationship between sound and image that I was exploring in this piece, and the way that I've explored it in other pieces as well. So the discussion may go beyond displacements in various points. To begin the discussion, I wanna open up again questions of I don't want to say the relationship between form and content, because the way that I've presented these issues, form and content are never like container and what goes into the container. The relationship, the dialogue between ideas of form and ideas of message have always been in my work much more complicated than you can really describe with a metaphor as, something like an object. And it always, seems to me that that metaphor of form content is it belies the more complex and dynamic relationships between a lot of different elements in that take place when we attempt to communicate any kind of meaning to another that has a different set of experiences from us. So, but that having been said, provisionally, I'll use that expression, form and content, to talk about this relationship that I want to discuss between visual images, constructed visual images, and sculptural images, and an acoustic background that I created for this piece. So to begin with, let me narrate something about my life. And again, audience and viewers of this discussion will be aware that in terms of the content of Displacements, a big part of that content had to do with traumatic experiences, both mine and others' traumatic experiences. And I think that that's powerfully relevant again today, and again one of the reasons that I'm returning to this piece. So my experience from early childhood on, I've experienced something that's called anesthesia awareness. And without getting too much into what that nominalization might imply or mean, I'll just describe my individual experience of the phenomenon. And I'm not really interested in the way that it's formulated as a medical phenomenon so much as what I experience. So when I have from the time I was a child, if I had surgeries that I can recall, but I recall them in a particular way. So, and some anesthesics are worse than others. For example, nitrous oxide is the worst for me in terms of my ability to recall the events that occur when I'm under, because I'm not really under. And my experience of nitrous oxide is something like the following. So I'm immobilized, but I'm experiencing the events, particularly the sounds and the experience of pain that are involved in whatever the procedure is. So my visual memory of the event, it's like my eyes are closed, or I'm blind in that respect. But I experienced the pain, and I experienced the feeling of being immobile, and then and I experienced the sound as well. So whatever discussion is going on during the procedure or the surgery, I hear it, and I feel it. Then something interesting happens, especially if the pain is in excess of what's really tolerable. What my mind does is it produces a kind of like dream narrative to explain the pain. So I'll give some examples. So I remember one instance in which I was given nitrous oxide, and it was in a dentist's office, and my dream narrative explaining the event involved imagining or hallucinating or having this waking dream that I was chained, right? That explained the immobility, chained to the chair, and I recall like the dentist and the assistant there, I hallucinated that they had different kinds of heads, like maybe different animal heads or monstrous heads, and they were casually sort of discussing what was happening. And I can't speak, so I can't speak, and I can't move. That was one hallucination. The worst one was I had an ear infection when I was a child, and I guess the way that they deal with it is they drill a hole in your ear very carefully, and relieve the pressure of the infection. And what I recall is hallucinating that I was on because like this incredible noise, just like incredible noise and incredible pain, and I hallucinated that I was on a battlefield, and that the noise was explained by like the explosions of these cannons. And it was sort of a I don't know why, but it was sort of a Civil War setting. Maybe that's at that time what I imagined was the one of the goriest and bloodiest examples of a war scene. I don't know particularly why, but it was a sort of Civil War scenario that I had imagined for myself to explain what was going on. So I had this interesting experience, again based on my unique way of being an embodied subject in the world. And very early on I enjoyed exploring certain kinds of relationships between sound and image that I wasn't really necessarily aware like that grew out of this experience, but that I had become interested in these disjunctive relationships because of my own experiences. So I remember when I was in junior high school and high school, I used to enjoy turning on the television, and instead of listening to the sound that was provided on the show or in the narration of putting on a record. So I can remember, for example, like listening to David Bowie's song Fashion, and watching, for I don't know what channel it was on or what it was referring to, but this series of bulldozers demolishing buildings. It was really kind of wonderful liberation of the elements of experience into these component parts that could be reassembled in different ways to provide entirely different meanings. And so I remember that, or another one was watching a nature channel while listening to Bob Dylan's The Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands. So this was something that I had done as it was a kind of art, I suppose, early on, but very rarely had an audience, beyond myself. I think occasionally, a couple of friends and I would, create these like found movies, based on this technique. So I had that experience, in the background when I came to this piece. And then my first viewings of avant-garde film in a class that I took from Standish Lauder, probably around 1985, reminded me of this experience again. Some of the images and sound connections. Say Bruce Conner wasn't particularly interesting to me, but what happened in Michael Snow's Wavelength, I found fascinating because of this kind of like eerie recognition that I had with the components. And again, another one that struck me as being particularly interesting was the way that Harry Smith, for example, uses that first Beatles album in as accompaniment, to early abstractions, and it wasn't, just the disjunctive, the way that it's set up. His pieces, are clearly segmented, and the segments of the music and the segments of the pieces, don't fit together. And it wasn't just that, but it was the experience that I had of this disjunction was that my mind was, busy trying to make sense of these, apparently arbitrary relationships that were a result of the suturing of this track to this visual track to this acoustic track, and so it became, a sort of like another one of these revelations that that's what our mind does. And it occurred to me when I was watching, the Harry Smith, that that our experience of sound and vision in the world is in fact like a kind of disjunction. The dog is barking in the background, but what's going on the screen is very different. Now we bring that together and we create, a coherence and a cohesion in time and space of these events. But it's very much a fabrication of the mind. So what I was experiencing with Harry Smith and noticing, paying attention to the way that the mind works, is not just that we do this because we're uncomfortable with disjunction, but the disjunctions are already there, and the mind is the apparatus that brings this illusion of cohesion and coherence to things. So that was, lurking somewhere, all of that, and then the history, of that particular part of trauma was lurking, somewhere in my mind when I thought about how I wanted to create connections between these stations that I had created for Displacements, and the simple way of describing what I did was I simply I made tape recordings that fit one piece, and I just moved them to a different piece. So you would call them stations 1 through 5. So station 1 had station 3's tape, and station 5 had station 4's tape, or whatever it was. And I moved them around in that manner to create again this fractured, but fractured, but engaging. I didn't want them to just be broken. I wanted the audience's labor in putting the pieces together was sort of a kind of metaphor for a kind of physicianship, or it was a way of bringing the pieces together was more than just puzzle making. It was an act of healing, right? So and it was performing the work of the mind that we always perform, but making you aware of that work, because we're always making sense of the relationship between the dog barking in the background and the imagery and my hand, presented on the screen, and what's going on with the slideshow. But we're not always aware that we're we're doing it. So I was hoping that making one aware of the way that consciousness works in a certain sense could help produce, you know, uh, a new relationship to the activities, both of consciousness and of engaged action in the world, so that we don't think of ourselves as, oh, I'm just, sitting here passively, experiencing all of these things. I'm never sitting here passively experiencing all of these things. I'm always doing a lot of work, but I'm not necessarily aware of it, because that work isn't always, conscious or voluntary. A lot of times it's involuntary, and we're completely unaware of it. So I wanted the relationships, that were disjunctive or displaced or moved, or to become part of all of that. And so, for example, what I did with the piece that involved Denny, the blind and mobilely limited young man that I met in the park. His tape, and in which I reproduced the questions that he asked me and my responses to those questions, I moved to a different station and placed in a station called Rusty and Deb. And the narration that I had of being assaulted, I moved from, well, actually, there was no representation of that. That was one of the sort of blind spots, right? Because I wanted these blind spots as well. But I put that in the piece in which I sort of gave the master metaphor, and master is a bad word, but the dominant metaphor of putting together with those wooden blocks, and so that was the localized trauma that was the closest in time and space to the event, and hence it made a kind of sense to me to use that particular recording in the central piece.